In the final days of December 2025, something happened in Tehran that had not occurred since the Islamic Revolution swept the mullahs to power 47 years ago. The merchants of the Grand Bazaar closed their shops and walked into the streets in open defiance of the regime. To understand why this matters, you must understand what the Grand Bazaar represents, because it is not merely a marketplace, it is the beating heart of Persian commerce, a labyrinthine network of covered passages where trade has flourished for over 1,000 years. In 1979, it was the Bazaar merchants who helped finance the revolution, who shut down the economy and strangled the Shah's regime until it collapsed. For 47 years, they have been the financial backbone of the Islamic Republic. And now they have turned against the very system they helped create, and in doing so they may have signed its death warrant. What began as a protest against a collapsing currency has exploded into the largest uprising since the revolution itself, with millions flooding the streets across all 31 provinces. The death toll is climbing into the hundreds. Thousands have been arrested, and the internet has been severed nationwide as the regime fights for survival behind a wall of digital silence. President Donald Trump has warned that America is locked and loaded, while the exiled son of the last Shah prepares to return to a homeland he fled as a teenager nearly 50 years ago. This is the story of the 2026 Iranian Revolution, a story of hubris, humiliation, and the terrible arithmetic of regime survival. Before we dive in, why not hit subscribe and drop a like? It really helps out. Before the economy collapsed, before the bazaars closed, the Islamic Republic suffered something far more devastating to a regime built on revolutionary mythology. It was humiliated on the battlefield and exposed as a paper tiger before the entire world. For decades, Iran had constructed what it called the axis of resistance, a network of proxy forces stretching from Lebanon to Yemen, designed to project power beyond its borders and threaten enemies without risking direct confrontation. Hezbollah in Lebanon with its vast arsenal of rockets, Hamas in Gaza, Assad in Syria, the linchpin connecting Tehran to the Mediterranean, and the Houthis in Yemen threatening global oil supplies. This architecture of Iranian power, built over 4 decades at a cost of tens of billions of dollars, was systematically demolished in the space of 18 months. The destruction began in October 2023 when Hamas attacked Israel, triggering a chain of events that would consume Iran's entire regional strategy. Israel responded not just in Gaza but across the entire axis. By autumn 2024, Hezbollah's command structure had been decapitated, its leader Hassan Nasrallah eliminated along with most of his senior officers. Then in December 2024 came the blow that shattered the axis entirely. The fall of Bashar al-Assad, Iran's closest Arab ally, swept from power by rebel forces in a lightning offensive. Assad had been propped up by Iranian money and blood since 2011. Tehran had spent billions keeping him in power, had sent its own soldiers to perish in Syrian streets. Syria was the land bridge connecting Iran to Hezbollah, the corridor through which weapons and fighters flowed to Lebanon. Without it, the axis was severed at its spine. As one analyst observed, there is no axis without access, and Iran had just lost everything. But the worst humiliation was yet to come, delivered not by proxies, but directly to the Iranian homeland itself. On June 13, 2025, Israel launched Operation Rising Lion, and what followed over the next 12 days exposed the Islamic Republic as a military fraud. More than 200 Israeli fighter jets struck over 100 targets across Iran in a single night, hitting the nuclear facilities at Natanz, Fordo, and Isfahan that were supposed to be impenetrable. Israeli operatives assassinated senior Revolutionary Guard commanders and nuclear scientists. The intelligence chief of the IRGC was eliminated. Car bombs detonated across Tehran. Iran retaliated with everything it had. Nearly 900 ballistic missiles and over 1,000 armed drones launched at Israeli cities in the largest such barrage in history. But here is what the Iranian people were never supposed to understand. Despite unleashing their entire arsenal, the damage to Israel was limited. Most missiles were intercepted and neutralized. 28 Israeli civilians perished, a tragedy, but a fraction of what Iran's generals had promised. The asymmetry was devastating and impossible to hide. Then, on June 22nd, the United States entered the war, and the humiliation became complete. American B-2 stealth bombers dropped bunker-buster munitions on the underground nuclear facilities at Fordow and Natanz, sites buried deep beneath mountains of rock and concrete. President Trump declared that the strikes had completely obliterated Iran's nuclear enrichment capabilities, setting the program back by years. The billion-dollar Russian and Chinese air defense systems that were supposed to protect the homeland had failed utterly. Not a single American aircraft was touched. Iran fired missiles at an American base in Qatar in retaliation, but no casualties were reported, and Trump announced a ceasefire the following day. Supreme Leader Khamenei claimed victory, but the Iranian people had eyes. They had seen their military humiliated, their vaunted defenses penetrated like paper. The regime that had built its legitimacy on resistance to America and Israel had been exposed as impotent when actually confronted by its enemies. A wounded regime can survive military defeat if it can feed its people. The Islamic Republic could not. The Iranian economy had been deteriorating for years under the weight of sanctions and mismanagement, but in December 2025, the deterioration became a collapse. On December 28th, the Iranian rial plunged to a record low of 1.45 million to the US dollar. To understand the scale of this catastrophe, consider that in 1979, $1 was worth 70 rials. The currency had lost more than 99.9% of its value since the revolution. The savings of an entire generation had been vaporized. Inflation surged to nearly 50%, with food prices rising by an astonishing 72% compared to the previous year. Health and medical goods increased by 50%. The government announced plans to raise taxes further when the new year began in March. The average monthly wage for Iranian workers had fallen to barely $100, far below the $450 that government agencies acknowledged a family needs to survive. Meat, chicken, and dairy became luxuries that ordinary Iranians could no longer afford. The middle class was being crushed into poverty. One observer described seeing a man in a supermarket tear the wings off a chicken and flee because he could not afford to pay. This is what economic collapse looks like in human terms. Tehran and other major cities faced hours of water rationing while rolling electrical blackouts plunged neighborhoods into darkness. Rice importers gathered outside the central bank, warning that the government had failed to allocate currency for food imports for an entire year. They warned of imminent famine. The central bank eliminated the preferential subsidized exchange rate for most products, meaning prices for everything except medicine and wheat would skyrocket further. This was not a crisis that emerged from nowhere. It was the culmination of decades of corruption, mismanagement, and the crippling weight of international sanctions. The regime had spent its treasury on foreign adventures, on propping up Assad, on arming Hezbollah, on building missiles that failed when they were actually needed. And now the bill had come due, and there was nothing left to pay it with. Against this backdrop of military humiliation and economic devastation, the spark came from the merchants of Tehran's Grand Bazaar on December 28, 2025. The shopkeepers of the Al-Edin shopping center and the electronics markets were the first to close. Their inventories were priced against the dollar, and with the rial in freefall, selling anything meant losing money. But what began as an economic protest transformed into something far more dangerous for the regime within 48 hours. Videos circulating on social media showed merchants chanting that they would die rather than accept humiliation, demanding the government address the currency crisis. The strike spread with astonishing speed. Isfahan, Shiraz, Mashhad, Kermanshah, dozens of cities within 2 days. By New Year's Eve, 17 of Iran's 31 provinces were in open revolt. Iran International, monitoring from outside the country, called it a historic break between the Bazaar and the Islamic Republic, a rupture not seen since 1979. The regime's own media briefly covered the protests, interviewing merchants who claimed their demands were purely economic, but the footage on social media told a different story. Within days, the chants shifted from economic grievances to something the regime fears above all else: explicit calls for its destruction. Crowds shouted death to the dictator, referring to Supreme Leader Khamenei. They shouted death to the Islamic Republic, rejecting the entire theocratic system. In a direct rejection of the regime's foreign adventures, protesters chanted "No Gaza, no Lebanon, my life only for Iran." In Mashhad, Iran's second-largest city and home to the holiest shrine in Shia Islam, protesters tore down a massive Islamic Republic flag and ripped it in half. Since you've made it this far, you're clearly enjoying the content. So please hit subscribe and drop a like. It helps more than you think. With that said, let's get back to it. The desecration of the flag in such a religiously significant city carried enormous symbolic weight. Even the spiritual heartland was in revolt. Statues of Qasem Soleimani, the Revolutionary Guard commander venerated by the regime as a martyr, were torn down by angry crowds. A viral trend emerged. Iranian women lighting cigarettes to burn photographs of Khamenei, a deliberate act of defiance against both the supreme leader and the state's control over their bodies. By January 8th, protests had spread to all 31 provinces, with demonstrators in over 280 locations defying the government. Generation Z Iranians, whose political consciousness was forged during the 2022 Mahsa Amini protests, became the most visible force in the streets. Unlike 2022, which was led primarily by women, young men now played a larger role, confronting security forces directly and running battles across the cities. As the uprising gained momentum, an unexpected figure emerged from decades of exile to shape its direction. Reza Pahlavi, the 65-year-old son of Iran's last Shah. To understand Pahlavi, you must understand the tragedy of his family. He left Iran in 1978 to attend flight school in Texas and never returned. His father fled the following year as the revolution consumed everything. After his father's death in 1980, a royal court in exile declared Reza Pahlavi the heir to the peacock throne on his 20th birthday. He has spent 45 years waiting for this moment. On January 6, 2026, Pahlavi issued his first direct call for coordinated action, urging Iranians to chant simultaneously at exactly 8 p.m. on Thursday and Friday evenings. In a video message to his dear compatriots, he praised the demonstrators for their inspiring resistance and noted that larger crowds had forced security forces to flee and increased defections. When the clock struck 8 p.m. on January 8th, neighborhoods across Tehran erupted. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Crowds shouted, "This is the last battle. Pahlavi will return." Footage verified by international agencies showed thousands responding to the prince's call. In a separate message to Iran's security forces, Pahlavi posed a direct question. On which side of history will you stand, alongside the criminals or alongside the people? He declared that the issue was no longer whether the Islamic Republic would fall, only the timing of its collapse, which was closer than ever. The Economist reported that the protests had grown to be the biggest since 2009, with some veteran Iran watchers saying they were the largest since the Shah's overthrow. Pahlavi called for protesters to prepare to seize and hold city centers and announced that he was preparing to return to his homeland. Whether Pahlavi represents Iran's future or merely a symbol of resistance remains unclear, but for the first time in 47 years, the monarchy has a voice in Iranian streets. The Islamic Republic did not survive 47 years by showing mercy to its enemies, and as the protests escalated, it unleashed the violence that has kept it in power. Security forces opened fire on demonstrators with live ammunition in cities across the country: Tehran, Karaj, Isfahan, Mashhad, Shiraz. In Lordagan, Fars news agency reported that 3 people perished when security forces confronted protesters. In Asna, a plainclothes Revolutionary Guard agent shot a 21-year-old in the head. On January 3rd, Supreme Leader Khamenei declared that rioters must be put in their place, signaling that whatever restraint existed had ended. The Revolutionary Guard's provincial corps in Lorestan announced that the time for tolerance was over, pledging to target protesters without leniency. Iran's Attorney General warned that anyone participating in protests would be considered an enemy of God, a charge punishable by execution under Islamic law. State television broadcast coerced confessions from detainees, including an 18-year-old woman and a 16-year-old girl accused of leading riots. Security forces entered hospitals to arrest the wounded. Tear gas was fired inside medical facilities in Ilam and Tehran as doctors tried to treat the injured. Medical sources described scenes of horror. Families rushing to collect the bodies of their children, burying them in the same clothes without proper burial rites because they feared arrest. One surgeon reported that the emergency department had received at least 30 people with gunshot wounds to their limbs in a single night. Doctors in Neyshabur described security forces firing from rooftops, targeting even ordinary pedestrians who were not part of demonstrations. On January 8th, the government imposed a near-total internet blackout, severing the country from the outside world. Experts called it the worst shutdown in Iranian history. The blackout was designed to hide what came next. Reports emerged of mass casualties, with eyewitnesses in Kahrizak claiming they saw over 400 bodies at a single location. Iran International reported that at least 2,000 protesters had been killed over a 48-hour period. The Norway-based Iran Human Rights confirmed at least 51 deaths, including 8 children. The true death toll may never be known. That is precisely why the regime cut the internet. As the killing intensified, the world's attention turned to Washington, where a president who had just captured a foreign head of state was watching events unfold. On January 3rd, just days after American special forces had seized Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro in a stunning overnight operation, Trump posted a warning on Truth Social. He declared that if Iran violently attacked peaceful protesters, the United States would come to their rescue. America was locked and loaded and ready to go. Secretary of State Marco Rubio reinforced the message. When Trump tells you he is going to address a problem, he means it. The Venezuela operation was proof of American resolve. On January 10th, Trump escalated further, telling oil executives that if Iran's leaders started firing on protesters, America would start firing too. The Wall Street Journal and New York Times reported that Trump had been presented with military options for striking Iran, though no final decision had been made. The State Department issued a direct warning. Do not play games with President Trump. When he says he will do something, he means it. Iranian Parliament Speaker Ghalibaf responded by threatening that if America attacked, Iran would strike U.S. troops and Israeli targets in retaliation. But Trump's warnings appeared to have some effect. Analysts noted that the regime had not yet deployed the level of violence seen in the 2019 protests, when over 1,000 were killed. The regime faced an impossible calculus: crack down hard enough to crush the uprising and risk American intervention, or show restraint and appear weak. It was the dilemma of every dying authoritarian system. The violence that preserves power in the short term often accelerates collapse in the long term. And so we arrive at the present moment, with the Islamic Republic of Iran facing the gravest threat to its existence since the revolution that brought it to power. Consider the forces arrayed against the regime: an economy in freefall, a currency worth less than toilet paper, a population that can no longer afford bread, a military humiliated by Israel and America, its vaunted air defenses exposed as worthless, its nuclear program set back by years. An axis of resistance in ruins, its proxies defeated, its allies overthrown, its supply lines severed. A Bazaar class that once financed the revolution, now financing the revolt against it. A generation of young Iranians who have no memory of the Shah, no investment in revolutionary mythology, and no fear of death. And hovering over everything, the threat of American military power wielded by a president who has already demonstrated his willingness to use it. The question is no longer whether the Islamic Republic is weakened. The question is whether it can survive. History offers some guidance. Authoritarian regimes can endure extraordinary pressure if they maintain internal cohesion and are willing to use unlimited violence. The regime in Tehran has survived sanctions, survived previous uprisings in 1999, 2009, 2019, and 2022. Each time it has deployed enough brutality to restore order. But there are signs that this time may be different. The defections that Pahlavi mentioned, the security forces fleeing from crowds, the unprecedented breadth of the protests. When the Bazaar turns against a regime, when the merchant class withdraws its support, history suggests the end is near. It happened to the Shah, and it may be happening to the mullahs. The internet blackout is itself an admission of fear. A confident regime does not need to hide from its own people. The threats of execution, the coerced confessions of teenagers, the firing on hospitals, these are not the actions of a government in control, but of a system in panic. And yet the regime retains formidable tools: the Revolutionary Guard, the besieged militia, the network of informants and enforcers built over 5 decades. It retains the willingness to commit mass murder. The 2019 crackdown proved that. The question is whether murder will be enough this time. What happens in the coming days and weeks will determine not just the fate of Iran, but the balance of power across the entire Middle East. If the Islamic Republic falls, the reverberations will be felt from Beirut to Baghdad to Sana'a. The entire architecture of Iranian influence will collapse with it. If it survives, it will emerge weakened, isolated, and more dangerous, a wounded animal with nuclear ambitions and nothing left to lose. For the Iranian people, who have endured 47 years of theocratic rule, economic strangulation, and international isolation, the stakes could not be higher. They are risking their lives in the streets, facing bullets and batons, and the threat of execution, for a chance at freedom that may never come again. And for the watching world, the question is whether we are witnessing the death throes of the Islamic Republic, or merely another chapter in its long and bloody survival. The answer will be written not in Washington or Jerusalem, but in the streets of Tehran, Isfahan, and Mashhad, by ordinary Iranians who have decided they would rather die on their feet than live on their knees. Whatever happens next, this much is certain: the Islamic Republic of Iran, weakened by war, bankrupted by mismanagement, abandoned by its own merchants, will never be the same again. The regime that once boasted of exporting revolution across the Middle East is now fighting for its survival within its own borders. The system that claimed divine sanction is being judged by its own people and found wanting. And the men who rule from Tehran, who have spent 47 years telling Iranians that their suffering was the price of resistance, are discovering that the Iranian people have finally decided the price is too high. This is the story of the 2026 Iranian Revolution, and it is not yet finished. But when the history books are written, they may record that it began in a bazaar, with shopkeepers who simply refused to open their doors. If you found this perspective valuable, consider subscribing. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I read every one of them. Thank you for watching.